What's up, everybody? My name's Chance, and welcome back to the fifth week of the FNM podcast, or Friday Night Magic podcast. With me, as always, we have MTG Jeff and Hello Good Game.
Hello, everybody. How you guys doing today?
Hey,
Now, today we're going to be talking about brewing, how we personally brew, maybe some tips for y'all to brew, and sort of breaking down our thought process behind like when we take a deck or a card or whatever it is that we're brewing around, and how we go from nothing, a 0 out of 60 card deck, all the way to a fully built, fully functioning pile of jank.
That's a great way to put it. Fully functioning polygenic. Because for me, especially with brewing, I love being able to add in my own flavor, my own like extra little bits where it's like I'm gonna include Sir Conrad in every deck that I can, even though I know he's not that great. That doesn't necessarily mean that I don't know how to brew a more competitive deck. But I think that's why it's all about kind of coming in and finding your own flavor. And so I think as we talk about this, we're all going to kind of tell you a little bit of our own flavor of how we build and brew. But we also have done this enough times to know, okay, I won't have a good enough content for you guys to watch if it doesn't win at some point. And so I'm hoping that at least we can give like, okay, these are ways that we turn kind of janky decks, the things that you're brewing around different cards, and how to turn them into decks that will actually win you games, will actually, let you play this super fun deck that will, and actually win with it. Because we've all built those decks where it's like, man, this would be so fun if, like for me, it's a Fleet Swallower. You guys remember the 7 mana fish? Whenever it attacks, it mills the top half cards of their library of the opponent. I have tried to build it on that deck so many times, and I've actually made it work one time. But again, it's just one of those like it's never a consistent type of deck, and it's hard to ever make it work. But that's the fun of Magic is building and brewing around these really interesting, fun cards that other people kind of forget about. And so that's what we want to talk about today.
Yeah,
I think I think
let's
Jeff did a perfect job articulating that. That your first and foremost objective when building any Magic deck, whether it's competitive or jank, is having that plan in place before you start. Because there are a lot of cards in the collection here within Arena now, and it's easy to get lost and just get sidetracked in a rabbit hole, and then you do end up with maybe a pile of not so functioning jank. So you really want to have that game plan, and it's okay to make the jank decks with the low win rates just to have some fun, right? To try to get those combos if that's your plan, right? But don't maybe set out to make a top ranked deck and then fill it with terrible cards. So
Absolutely.
to try to overview the different kind of decks you can build, the different plans that we have in mind when building our decks. Then I think maybe next week we're going to get into building a deck live with the three of us. So that should be really cool.
Yeah, definitely excited for that. And I was gonna say, I think the Moby Dick card for me that I'm always chasing the big well is Simic Ascendancy. That card is
There actually is a Moby Dick card, by the way, just so you know.
all right. Well, not the actual Moby Dick card. But yeah, Civic Ascendancy, it's always escaping me, and I recently built a deck on it this past week because of Conclave Mentor, and I was like, this has to work.
Yep.
There's no way that Civic Ascendancy doesn't actually get to go off now. And so for the deck, I guess that I'm going to be diving into or explaining the background on that I went into is Civic Ascendancy and how you can build around this and get those counters and not have your opponent just remove it as soon as you're getting to the 20 counters, because it's always a feels bad thing. But I feel like with M21 we have heroic intervention and all that. Might could actually make this pile of jank into a real deck.
That's an archetype I'm actually interested in seeing and looking at with you guys, because we do have new things like the Ozolith. So if your tokens do get bounced from Simic Ascendancy, just throw them on someone with Trample, right? Go home with it.
Yeah,
And you can even have something where, like, you on the same turn, if you have Ozolith, which I've gotten 41 counters, I think, onto an Ozolith before, um, you could just throw down another creature, also put all those counters onto it and Simic Ascendancy. One of the biggest issues, though, is the whole waiting until the next turn to untap before you can have it. So yeah,
Yes.
with talking about with brewing and everything, just first off, like because we did talk about all the janky type stuff. Just so you guys know, when it comes to competitive brewing, first off, I just want to touch on that before we jump into just kind of how to start from scratch and everything. The reason why we're talking about this and brewing with more janky type stuff is because I think we all agree one of the best ways to brew competitive decks is to see what's happening in the metagame. you see what's happening there because you have to brew interaction, brew everything based around what is competitive. And there's different tiers. There's tier 1, which is, these are the decks to beat. They are winning consistently against all decks. Right now, that's Bant Ramp, the Mono Black Embrace deck, Mono Red, Rakdos Sack, and Jund Sacrifice. I think there might be one other one, like Sultai Ramp or something. So those are the decks that are kind of in that top tier slot where they are decks that will win consistently against each other. I think the Bant Ramp right now maybe has the highest win percentage. It's kind of going back and forth because people keep playing different interaction, finding different ways to do everything. And so that's how metagame goes. And knowing those top tier decks, it's because people have played around it quite a bit and everything. And so there's the top tier, and then there's tier 2, which is one of those where like the tier 2, you should be able to beat these top decks. And I think that most of us, this is what we are trying to shoot for every time. Is we're trying to hit this tier 2 level with our decks, even though we're playing jankier stuff in it, because we want to be able to beat the top decks, and maybe even consistently. Maybe sometimes it's like a meta changer where like you were built to beat these 4 decks in the meta, and you hope you don't run up against this one, type of thing, and that's another type of deck. So tier 2 is this where it's like it's powerful, it's really good. It may just take over the game, but it's not going to be as consistent at win condition. And then there's tier 3, tier 4. Tier 4 is kind of the janky of the jank. That's where Simic Ascendancy and like it was at least, and now we're trying to bring it up to tier 3, tier 2. If we can, that type of stuff. And it just kind of keeps going down where it's like, okay, it's not going to consistently beat these decks, but we're trying to win in a fun and interesting way. So just so you guys know, like we recognize that there are tier 1 decks and how to build those. And the way that I brew those typically is I look at the metagame. I will even net deck for those ones, and then rebrew, rechange the numbers of like, okay, I want 3 of these instead of 4. I want 2 of these, whatever. And that's just something you kind of do along the way. We can definitely talk about that as well. But I feel like just for the sake of interest of a new set coming out, seeing some cards not being played by everyone, I'm sure there's a lot of you guys out there that are looking for interesting stuff to play. I think we're going to try to keep a little bit more of the conversation focused more towards those tier 3, tier 2, trying to get the janky stuff up to tier 2 if we can in this deck or in this video.
Yeah, and one thing, before we go and hop into the jank and all that, I want everyone to know that net decking is not a bad thing. Taking someone's deck and making it your own, or like working it around, or even taking it 1-for-1. That's not a bad thing. The whole point of Magic, and I feel like a lot of people forget this, getting caught up in win percentages and the whole ranked aspect of it, is have fun. So if you want to go steal a whole deck list 1-for-1, 75 card total, as long as you're having fun with it, that's all that really matters at the end. And this is, like Jeff said, we're mostly focusing on those people that are like us, that like taking these interesting cards and seeing these combos that you're not going to get at tournaments because they're just not classified as good enough. And generally what that means, or where that bar cuts off at, is the consistency. It's all about consistency. Same with poker. You're not going to try to run too high and think that you're going to win ever, pretty much, right? So it's a matter of trying to win as often as you can with what you have at your disposal, right?
Really well said.
So hopping in.
I mentioned the Ozolith would be good. It only takes counters from creatures. I've now realized. So just let's scrap that. The Ozolith maybe is kind of cool with Simic Ascendancy because it'll help collect from your creatures. It's not going to help collect your counters from your Simic Ascendancy when Teferi bounces it. Bye.
Yeah, that was the main thing about Heroic Intervention that I was thinking, is like this could actually keep your Simic Ascendancy alive and all that. But enough about the Simic Ascendancy dream. I'll harp on that. I'm sure I could harp on it for hours and hours. I love the idea of that card. I love the idea of alternate win cons, which kind of comes into this brewing. There's a lot of these alternate win cons in Magic with Simic Ascendancy, Once Upon a Time. And you'll probably never see these in a competitive sort of match. And it's because if they do become competitive, if these win cons become so competitive that they're hitting consistently, we probably are at a weird state in the game where it's too easy to achieve these win cons. The general win con for Magic is smashing into your opponent's face. If it becomes something else like building counters and all that, I think it's going to hinge the meta too much away from the core of what Magic is. So we want everyone to remember, as you're brewing, as you're building your decks out, try to remember, like, it doesn't have to win 100% of the time. It doesn't have to go off 100% of the time. It can go off 30% of the time. But, you know, when you're building the brew for a specific reason and you're selecting those cards, one of the major problems I had early on with brewing is there's a lot of good cards for whatever deck you're going to have, right? There's always going to be like 30 copies of removal, and it's your choice on which piece of removal you want. So when you're brewing, don't just think like, hey, is this good for the deck? Will this work? Think, hey, how often will this work for my deck? How many times, if I draw into this, can I actually play this? And that's one thing that I try to keep in mind when brewing and when building my decks is this piece of removal better than this piece? So try to take two cards and put them side by side rather than putting them beside your deck and saying, will this play with this? Because generally you're going to come up with, yes, it will play. But how efficiently is kind of the check mark for does it enter or get kicked from the deck.
So quick touch on the win rate. I know a lot of people are really focused on this. And I remember hearing a while ago that expected professional win rate in the MPL is roughly 53 to 54%. Then if a deck is outperforming this percentage, the win rate in that top ranked competitive environment, that's when they actually start to look at and address card bans within the certain decks. And then as far as decking goes, I don't think it's a bad thing either. That's probably how we all got to where we are today, is by looking at those net decks, what is the best, playing it for ourselves, learning about those high value interactions, how the game works, and then taking all of that information and knowledge that we've received and injecting it into our future builds. So don't shy away from playing the top ranked decks. Then also don't be so concerned maybe about the win rate.
So let's jump in a little bit to like the meat and potatoes of this. As far as I feel like a good way to start this is, okay, what are the cards that you guys in core set 21, we got a new set, what are the cards that you guys are excited to build around, but it's a little bit more of a challenge to actually like jump into? For me, the first one that comes to mind is like Brash Taunter. The 5-mana 1/1 indestructible. Whenever it's dealt damage, it deals that much damage to a target opponent. That card where it's just like this janky type of card where you know that the effect of it is really, really powerful, but it kind of makes it hard to build around something like this. And so that's the one for me. What about you guys? What are some cards that you guys have been wanting to build around, but it may be a little bit more difficult to make them tier 2, tier 3?
Just a quick comment on your Brash Taunter as I pull it up here. I see that we can pay 3 and tap it to have it fight another target creature. My mind immediately just goes to Indestructible, which we've been flooded with in M21, and then a little bit of Death Touch, right? Because he is a 1/1, so the fight effect maybe isn't so hot. But if you could combo that off, it has Indestructible on it natively, I see. So it just needs Death Touch. That's awesome. As far as cards that I've been really excited to play around, and I've been focusing on them a lot, Terror of the Peaks and Fiery Emancipation. Love it. Fiery Emancipation, whenever you deal damage to target, you deal 3 times or triple that damage. And then we all know Terror of the Peaks. It's a 5/4 flyer. Whenever your opponent targets him with a spell, they take 3 damage or have to pay 3 life, sorry. And then whenever a creature enters the battlefield, Terror of the Peaks will deal damage equal to that creature's power to any target as well. So I think these are cards that are maybe, well, Terror of the Peaks is a little bit easier to incorporate into our brews. Fiery Emancipation, that's one of the ones that's a little bit harder, a little bit down on that priority list. And it's going to take a little bit more work to make it viable, right?
Yeah, and one thing when you're looking at some of these cards, something like Terror of the Peak, something like Fiery Emancipation, you need to look at the value they bring when they enter the battlefield and how you're getting them into the battlefield when you're looking at brewing decks. So sure, you can take a Fiery Emancipation, you say, well, this is a 6-mana enchantment that does basically nothing when it enters unless you're attacking or you're proccing something or whatever. So again, whenever you're going to brew and you have your staple card that you're brewing around, because sometimes you brew based on a deck idea and sometimes you brew based on, you know, 1 or 2 cards that you're trying to staple that deck at. The best thing I found for myself, at least when brewing and making decks efficient, is I'll take that card and I'll put a pin in it, right? Like, this is staying in this deck no matter what the rest of the deck looks like. The two questions I always ask myself: how am I getting there, and what am I doing after I'm there, right? Because that's generally the two biggest things you need to know with the deck is how are you playing this card, and when I play it, is it just going to get to fairy bounce, or whatever? If it does, can I get some value before I'm losing my fun stuff, right?
Yeah, you have to build your deck knowing that someone else is playing a deck against you. I feel like sometimes you build a deck and like, oh man, this will be so cool if this thing happened. I ran into this even, as I was building decks for my channel, for everything like that. I kept building decks thinking like, man, I am going to do this thing. And I forget that they get to interact, that they actually have cards that they're playing as well. It's not a one person gameplay. I mean, Control thinks that pretty often, but that's okay.
Yeah.
But yeah, so that's the kind of thing. So like you're saying with Fire Emancipation, super cool card. You know that there's tons of power with this one, and this is something that again, just like Obosh, you can have it slam down on turn 6, and if you have a board, bam, you get to do some pretty sweet stuff with it for sure. But you also have to make sure you're playing not just a bunch of damage dealing type stuff. You might need to throw in Heraldic Banner. How do you get there a turn early? How do you get there a little bit quicker? You might need to play something else that actually ramps up to the Fiery Emancipation to be able to play something else there. And which then changes up your deck as well. You have to play a 3-mana enchantment, a 3-mana artifact of Heraldic Banner to get to Fiery Emancipation. That changes what kinds of cards you can actually be playing in the early game as well, because if you're going to be playing, Heraldic Banner, it changes everything. You then have to stay in mono red probably because you don't want to be splitting the cost with the Heraldic Banner. Heraldic Banner works really great with it. Anyway, so it's trying to find all of these synergies and going through. And I think it's hard to talk about brewing without talking about each specific card and everything. And I'm hoping that we can kind of give the conversation to a point where it is a little bit generic, so this kind of lasts even when the next set comes out, even when other stuff goes on. So I think that first off, let's talk about archetypes. What are the different archetypes of decks? So yeah, help me out because I always forget some of them. But there's aggro, tempo, yeah, tempo, mid-range. We'll talk about one of these what they are. So aggro, first off, is I am trying to get your life total down as quick as humanly possible, which a lot of good aggro decks do it in about turn 4. If they go uninteracted with whatever, they can kill them from 20 to 0 around turn 4. What is tempo?
Also, while we're talking about each of these, you need to remember, like, when you're playing these decks and you're saying, like, need to deal 20 damage by turn 4 or turn 5, you need to keep that in mind when you're brewing. Like, that needs to be, I'm brewing an aggro deck, that needs to be your focus. So do you really need that eliminate in your deck to remove a creature if your main concern is dealing 20 damage by turn 4? Because eliminate doesn't do any damage. So, sorry, Jeff, back to you.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, so yeah, same type of thing. And you can adjust your deck to be aggro, tempo, mid-range as you're building it as well. Like, that's okay to kind of change things up as you're brewing it and building it. But just know that once you have a finished product, you're wanting it to kind of fit in these archetypes to an extent. So yeah, so that was aggro. Aggro, turn 4, turn 5, you're wanting to end the game with damage, and then maybe have the consistency to maybe get through the more controlling type decks. But what would you guys say counts as tempo?
Tempo for me is a little bit of a hybrid strategy where it splits the middle or the difference between aggro and control. Still want those early low-cost mana creatures out right away. But then you also, once you have them on the field, and now Flash is great for this because you can combo them with counter spells. So you have the choice to maybe you play first, get that 1 drop out, and then your opponent doesn't play. Now you have a quench, doesn't play again, you get to put a creature in with Flash, and then it just snowballs and snowballs and snowballs where your creature amount keeps growing, is staying at 0 because you counter literally everything he does. Not only counters go great into the tempo decks, but draw engines as well, because you're going to need to be continually drawing more counters to help oppress him, because without that, he'll just be able to push through it because you're each drawing 1 card at a turn. So you need to make sure that you're squeezing more value out of your lemons than he's able.
Yeah, I actually feel like tempo is one of the hardest ones to proactively go into and build around, because you are trying to juggle so much with the efficiency of damage and all that, and you don't have such a hard limit of, okay, turn 5, they got to be dead. Tempo, I mean, it could realistically go to turn 7, turn 8, but as long as you're maintaining that control, you're good. So when you're building the tempo, try to keep it, like HGG said, like a 50-50 on like damage and control, and you want to ride that fence hard.
Yeah, being able to have basically with tempo, the good way to think about it is like, okay, instead of trying to hit in for 8 or 10 points of damage in one turn, like Aggro's trying to do, you know, by turn 4, turn 5, instead you're trying to hit for 3, maybe 4 points of damage every turn, which 3 damage every turn takes 7 turns. And so you're going to have to somehow control the game to keep that 3 damage hitting in every single time for 7 turns. And so that's basically what tempo is doing, is trying to hit that same place. And so then going up the line, just next is the mid-range place. So what would you guys call a mid-range deck?
This is difficult, I feel, to discern the line between tempo and mid-range, because tempo is oftentimes you're answering your opponent's stuff during their turn, right? You're using unsummons, you're using brazen borrowers. To whereas with mid-range, I feel like it's more so about the value of your own cards and less about you trying to stop the value of your opponent. So you'll see in a lot of the mid-range decks, you have something like Rotting Regisaur, to where it'll just avoid the Storm's Wraths, the damage dealing board wipes, if that makes sense. And so it's not so much about stopping your opponent from doing what they want to do, but rather boosting what you're doing to where they can't, if they take away your value, rather, you're not losing everything. You still have that swing in, and you can afford to get board wiped and still come right back. So towards tempo, you're concerned with what your opponent's doing. I feel like mid-range, you're less concerned with what they're doing and just making sure that your stuff is so efficient that it doesn't matter what they're doing.
For me, mid-range is all about getting more value out of your cards than your opponent can get out of his. We're talking ramp, primarily early game, and then getting like those 4 drops on turn 3 and 5 drops on turn 4. Your opponent's not going to be able to get to until his turn 4 or turn 5, so you're getting that out early. A lot of times those creatures just have so much value within them that it'll make the difference.
Yeah, so what I found is like tempo is trying to get out a 3 power thing or something like that, something that can get in for 3-4 points of damage. Mid-range is going to slow the game down a little bit more, have a ton of removal for aggro, maybe have even some control to play up against, or counter spells to play up against control to not let them get too much on the battlefield. But then slam something with 5 power, 6 power, something that will get in hasty or whatever. So it's still like a semi-aggressive deck where I am trying to get you from 20 to 0. That's mid-range can be played a bunch of different ways. It's not just creatures. You can play mid-range and have it be, typically it's more about the converted mana costs, like the average converted mana costs counts for mid-range as well, where like aggro, you're really low to like two converted mana costs is the average. Tempo is about 3 to 4. Mid-range is like 4 to 5 as a not an average cost necessarily, but like you're having a lot more expensive cards. So that's one way to look at it. But again, mid-range for me, I feel like is typically more creatures the way that I build them. And that's how I try to build it. I know that if I'm going to build a mid-range deck playing something like Terror of the Peaks, we were talking about that earlier. Terror of the Peaks is a 5-mana 5/4. It has an amazing amount of text on it that's really, really powerful. But I know I have to survive to turn 5 to play it and then try to keep it on the battlefield somehow. And so I'm going to try to get it, get the value out of this beefy creature. And so you have to be able to survive, so you have to be able to have the removal. And so you're building it completely differently. Instead of having 26, 27 creatures in the deck, like aggro decks sometimes do, instead you're going to be playing maybe 20 creatures and having 6 more slots for removal, 6 more slots for just other interaction. And so that's the way that I tend to build my mid-ranges. I try to make sure, okay, if this is going to be filled mid-range, I need to bring in the control aspect of it, the interaction aspect of it to actually keep my stuff alive.
I also feel like one big difference, at least for me personally, with mid-range and tempo is generally with mid-range, I want when something enters the battlefield, whether it be a creature, planeswalker, whatever, I want it to add value almost immediately. Whereas with tempo, I'm kind of more okay with just getting down the body and then leaving mana back to defend the body. Right? Mid-range, I'm feeling like questing beast. Right? you throw it down, you can remove planeswalkers dealing damage. Even something like Rotting Regisaurs, where it doesn't add value necessarily as soon as it enters, it adds pressure as soon as it enters the battlefield, right? Where your opponent is like, okay, well, that's a 7-power creature. I either answer it this turn, or I'm almost getting half health in one swing, right?
Yeah. So like mid range for me, is a balance kind of between all of the archetypes a little bit. You do still want a little bit of aggro because you don't want to disregard your early mana curve. It's still important to be playing a 1-drop, a 2-drop, a 3-drop, or if like, just spending all of your mana each turn efficiently. Then balancing that, because normally in an aggro deck we don't have a lot of removal, if any at all, right? So balancing that with the removal, so we can take out his 3-drop or his 4-drop, which will allow us the time or the survivability now to get that 5 and 6 drop out, right? So it kind of becomes a blend of everything for me, but still, like Jeff said, primarily creature based, at least in my
Yeah. So then the other archetypes, we'll just kind of go through these real quick. So the other three I would say are ramp, control, and combo. Ramp is trying to get up to just the really big stuff. You see that with Ugin. Control, trying to get the big stuff, but it's doing it naturally. It's like they're just going to try to keep hitting lands every single turn, not let you play Magic so that they can play Magic at turn 7 with something big like a Dream Trawler like that. They can kind of close out the game and they can keep controlling it. And then combo is one that you don't typically see as much in Standard, because Standard has combos for sure, but usually has a hard time keeping them consistent, keeping them actually like going through and everything. And so I didn't want to spend all the time just on the archetypes themselves necessarily, but I wanted to kind of talk about what we were saying, like where, as you're picking a card, so like with Brash Taunter, 5 mana, 1/1 indestructible, it has this cool effect. If I'm wanting to build a deck around that, I didn't know what archetype I'm starting to build with, at least to start with the Brew and see where it's going to go with. And again, you can build 15 different versions of Brash Taunter. Like that's the fun thing about Magic, is there's a ton of cards to play with, tons of cards to build, but you're initially going to be looking at it. So it's 5 mana. I'm probably going to have to play something more mid-range. Otherwise, it's not going to ever get onto the battlefield. I need to have something with ramp, at least a little bit, early game interaction. And then because it has the ability of being able to deal damage, equal damage it's dealt, I'm probably going to want to throw a lot of damage dealing spells into the deck. That kind of stuff that I can deal it to that. So I'm already looking, okay, this is more mid-range, potentially up towards ramp or like a control type of deck. Those are like the three archetypes that I can see work well with Brash Taunter. And then you can start looking at the kind of stuff. So I know I'm going to need removal. I know I'm going to need ramp. I know I'm going to need this. And you can start figuring out those pieces as you go along. So then as you guys are looking at it, so what about you guys with, let's say you are trying to find ramp for a mid-range deck. How do you decide which is the best way to ramp with this?
Pick my colors first, right? So in your case with Brash Taunter, we're looking at red. Then a quick ramp that pairs with red really good is green. It almost pairs with everything. So then we have a Gruul deck, which is a aggro archetype primarily, right? And then because it is a goblin base creature type, then because I'm trying to ramp and get him out early, I go looking in this amazing search bar that Arena has. Keyword goblins cost less, and then I see maybe what that has to offer, and it just kind of becomes a rabbit hole of like, how can I get this out really early? And I just kind of collect ideas. So it's not uncommon for me to build a deck with 80 to 100 cards in it before I start trimming, just so I have a clear picture of everything that I could ever want to work with. I'm not missing any ideas. It's all there, and then I can just kind of cut it back and condense it as much as I can.
Yeah, that's actually a good little side note. When y'all are going to brew, and this is to the viewers, not y'all necessarily. I assume y'all do this. But when y'all are going to brew, like you remember how I said put a pin in it. You kind of want to come back to that pin like a spider's web, right? You don't want to do like a straight line like some marathon or a race where you have the idea for a deck and you're just sort of taking it further and further and further from that center point. You want to make sure that every card you're choosing, whether you're going mid-range or aggro or control, sort of ties back to that card, right? To where it's like if you're going for the Brash Taunter, you want something that's going to cause some form of damage to your Brash Taunter, right? So maybe keep that in mind when you're going to brew as well and you're looking at removal or whatever.
So that brings it to a really good point too, is how are you actually winning? That is the other really important thing. You're going to pick your card that you want to build around, or whatever. Because again, you start with fun. I think that that's something we all completely agree with. You have to start with something that's a fun idea, it's interesting, and then you kind of decide, okay, how am I actually going to win with this deck? And that's why we were talking about the archetypes. Is okay, I feel like this archetype will fit better for winning with it. But then you start looking at synergies as well as whatever connection make work. So how does Brash Hunter win? It wins by having it dealt damage. So there's definitely downsides, because it's indestructible. Trample, even though a big beefy creature will swing into it, if it has trample, it's only doing 1 damage to it because it only deals equal to its amount for lethal, and then it goes through. So we know that just blocking creatures isn't going to be consistent. We know that that's not going to happen every single time. So you have to find a way to deal damage to this on your own, in your own deck. And you might run up against control too that doesn't have that. Erebos's intervention, or not Erebos, Perforos's intervention.
Yeah, deal double damage to a creature.
Yeah. So this is a good. This is where you try to find synergy, and this is probably my favorite thing in Magic, is to try to find the synergies that make decks possible. So Perforos's intervention, X in a red, choose one. You can either make an elemental, big elemental, or it can deal twice X damage to target creature or planeswalker. So you're getting a boost in mana out of this. So instead of just being able to do mana damage equal to your mana on this, you can end up doubling. You can end up doing some pretty big stuff. So there's some really interesting ways you can go about creating this as the win condition in this deck. Cards like this are also helpful because you can use them just to help you get to the late game, get to turn 5, so you can play Bresh Taunter. You can use this as removal. You can use this as a finisher. There's a lot of different ways you can use it. And so then so for me, this is kind of what I do. I first off find the card I want. I find what kind of archetype that will work for it. And then I try to think of my win condition and synergies that I think are fun and interesting to create that win condition.
Yeah, Jeff, you keep mentioning synergies for the newer players. What he's talking about with synergies is you need to be looking at the key words on a card, and I'm not just talking about the big bold ones like indestructible, but with something like Brash Taunter, and it says like the amount of damage dealt to Brash Taunter deals that much damage to your opponent, right? So you want to look at those keywords, and then whenever you're going to search for these synergies we keep talking about, just try at first typing that into your search bar, damage, right? And go look at the red cards that can deal damage to creatures or you can deal damage to your opponents, and see like what you think again ties back to that Brash Taunter. So that's what we're talking about when we're talking about synergies here.
Just have me crafting.
What was that?
Just have me crafting here. I'm just busy crafting.
Yeah, and I think that this is a big reason why all of us actually created content channels or whatever. Like, I know for me, my play group in in my local game store was really focused on competitive play. And I was always the person that came with the marionette master, sacrifice all their treasures and kill you with this janky way of winning, or trying to make Fleet Swallower work. Still can't do it. Like all these more janky type of gameplays that for me was what really brought me joy. So I think that all of us are in this place where we probably each of us build like 3 new decks every single day. And some of them are good. At least for me, I know that's where I run into issues. So what I found, and I'd like to hear you guys' thoughts on this too. So I think that most of that everyone can kind of gather, okay, I need to find a win condition. I need to find some good synergies. I need to be able to build it in a certain archetype. The biggest thing that I see new players or people that have had issue with consistently finding good brews of their own is they will focus on only one win con. If you're a combo deck, that's okay. But for every other archetype, only one win condition. Control and combo can do this, but every other archetype, you need to be focused on having multiple win conditions. You have to be okay with, I want to win with Brash Taunter, but I might win with a Gruul Spellbreaker at the same time. That's probably going to be the way that I'm actually getting my last points of damage. So that's the kind of thing that I found. What about you guys? Have you guys seen that's helped with your brewing or anything like that, trying to find additional win conditions in the same deck?
First and foremost, like you said, I think we all do this for fun organically. So that's why I like to just pick a card first and then roll from that around it. And I also find that a lot of the community is just ultra focused on competitive Magic, which is fine. But for me, if it's not fun, why are you doing it? And yes, fun is winning. We can exponentially increase that factor when we're winning with some jank decks that we made ourselves, right? Um, so have fun, make the deck that you want, and just try to make it the absolute best deck you can. Play it in play queue if you want. You don't always have to go into standard rank, especially if you are a beginner player without these huge collections. Just play the game, have fun, farm your collection. That's the primary focus of Magic the Gathering for me.
Yeah, and like y'all both have hit Mythic. I've never hit Mythic before, but I've had fun with Magic for almost 2 years now. And majority of the time I play in standard queue because again, if you're someone that's just enjoying fun, don't let the Magic community or your friends be like, oh, that deck's trash. Don't let that discourage you. Who cares? And if you're down on a deck for a day, it's really really easy and simple to just pivot to a different deck and just sort of refresh the whole feeling for the whole day. And so for those of you that are just like all about the jank brews and all about having fun and not too competitive, keep that alive in yourself. Don't let it get beat out of you no matter how many times you lose, because even if you're playing a competitive deck, I can guarantee you right now you're still gonna lose. You're still gonna have those matches you lose.
Yeah.
So as far as like I want people to have tangible items or objectives that they can walk away after listening to this episode of the podcast. We kind of overviewed so far like the different kinds of decks, and then we took our first steps in how we're going to make that deck. So we overviewed picking the card that you want to build around, having fun, right? That's your first objective. Second objective is what kind of deck is this card belonging to, right? And then we talked about the different archetypes, the aggro, control, tempo, yada yada, right? Then we're looking at adding in synergies and combos to make it powerful, right? And then we also need to move on, once we've done that, to balance it with appropriate amount of creatures and non-creatures removal and land. So there's a lot more that we're going to have to touch on as well. But I just think it will be important to have a tangible list that people can maybe write down, and then how they're building their decks in the future, they can reference it, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and one thing, whether you're learning how to brew or you're going to brew, seeing the physical thing, and we were talking about this earlier. I can't remember if it was when I was recording or not, but with the new layout of the deck builder and being able to pull up that arrow, you can drag your cards around left and right, up and down, and set them to the side. This card is staying stable, so pull it all the way out to the right and leave it in that pile, and then build the rest of your deck to the left and reinsert that card. I've realized I'm a very visual person, and I can't say that all of Magic is, but I can safely assume, given we're all playing this cardboard game with little pictures on it, that we're all pretty visual people. So if it helps you, write down the names, draw the lines, like lay it out instead of just trying to keep it all in your brain and then having this big old jumble come out come time to add the cards in.
You mentioned dragging the cards around. When you are building your deck and you've got a couple cards in your deck, you can grab one and then it'll turn your cursor and give it a little plus arrow. And then you can slide that card wherever you want it. It doesn't have to belong with its converted mana cost anymore. So you can split up your deck into maybe the different cards that work together in different ways, right? So Jeff mentioned having multiple win conditions. Sometimes I like to separate the deck into the different win conditions and then have all of the supporting cards underneath, just to make sure that each have enough and are going to be able to get there on their own.
Right. And I think the layout really, not enough people swap back and forth, because if you have the layout on the right, it will always have the CMC top to bottom, which is very useful if you're looking at your deck and saying, hey, how efficient is this? And if you change it back and you want to go, like HGG said, bring some that are out of their CMC cost, if you swap back and forth, it won't destroy your piles. It won't automatically reorder them. So you can save that pile. Whenever you come back and you reopen it, it will leave like those 3 cards that you selected that are maybe 1 mana cost all the way over to the right for you. So don't be afraid to like swap it back and forth and get a good lay of the land, right?
Absolutely, yeah. So there's a ton of tools available for brewing decks, and again, like I think a big part of this is test it out. Like keep brewing. It's fun to keep going and brew your own decks as well. I think it's hard for us to get fully into specifics here because if we were talking about every single thing in brewing a deck, it would probably take about 2 days. Like just from the different things you can get into. And so like I think we're giving a little bit of vague things, a lot of things that kind of just are useful and helpful here. I think we did lay down really good just the base core of how you build a deck with brewing, the good things there.
So we talked about the different archetypes, right? And then one thing that's really nice about Arena is that we can suggest lands, and it's auto going to fill your lands for you. This used to be a big ordeal when building paper decks, right? You had to take a course on balancing lands. Now it's totally done for you. It could be a little bit better. It doesn't necessarily recognize when you're playing a mana fixing deck where you have lots of ramp and mana creatures. It's still going to try to suggest your mana based on your converted mana cost of all of your cards. So I guess one tip there, maybe a little bit of an intermediate tip, look at your decks, know what kind of archetype you're playing, know what's in your deck if you have mana fixing. If it is an aggro deck where your highest drop is a 3-drop, you can really shift that mana amount down from maybe 24 to 22. And if you're really risky, you could go as low as 20 potentially, right? And then where you're running that mid-range, you probably want at least 24 land plus your ramp. Then as a control deck, 24 to 26 there as well, right? Because you're really relying on always drawing a land, never not having that land drop and building up. Because in those other decks, you're utilizing your land for things other than just creatures. You're using your mana to draw. You're using it to remove his permanents as well, right? So once you've built your deck, look at your land. Is there any mana ramp creatures or mana fixing within it? And then maybe that gives you room for another card or two.
Yeah, and
Another thing too is like there's a lot of tools within MTG Arena, and we were talking about that. There's a lot of good stuff that you can use. You can also jump off of MTG Arena as well and use third-party sites. Aether Hub, Untap.in, MTG Goldfish. There's a bunch of them. So many websites that do really good stuff for this. One of the best things about those is that you can, as you're in the deck area, you can select your deck, and then there's an import export portion. If you export, copy that into a list onto a website. I typically use Aether Hub. You can actually then have that deck on there. It gives a little bit more insights onto the statistics of the deck, but you also let yourself draw opening hands. You can do simulated hands. So you can have it, draw an opening hand for the deck and see how it goes. I mean, on MTG Arena, you can just play a game as well, play against Sparky, that kind of stuff. Like, there's a lot of different ways you can do it. But if you're really wanting to fine tune decks, things like that, that's another way you can do it. Is trying to test out and see, is this going to be consistently giving me good enough hands? How is that going to play up against other people's decks? Does it have enough interaction? Does it have a good game plan? All those kinds of things are something you can definitely be looking at from a bunch of different tools that are available for you.
yeah, and that's another thing people need to keep in mind. You need to remember the real. I'm looking for a word here. The the realism of you actually playing certain cards. So if you're going to build a deck, think about, what am I playing turn 1? Okay. What am I playing turn 2? Okay. What am I playing turn 3? Because I've noticed a lot of people are like, hey, you should play this card and this card, but my 3 CMC slots will be completely filled up. So you need to think logically, like, I can't play 10 3-cost creatures all on turn 3. You can only play 1, right? So when you're deck building and you're brewing and all that, think about what you want most, because not everything's going to make the cut. Realistically, you're not going to hit all 3 CMC and then be able to play all of them 2 in one turn. You got that 1 at turn 1, you got that 1 at turn 2. So think about the actual chronological play steps of your deck, and I found that really helps whenever I'm going back through and cutting cards and slimming it down, right?
This brings up a good point, though. So let's have a bit of a discussion. Why bring it down to 60 cards? What's the reason? Because you can build up to 250 card decks. We've seen Yorion do stuff. So what is the reason why because I've had this question asked a lot in my comment section or whatever. Like, why not include these other cards? Why only stick with 60 cards? Or occasionally, because I do go up above 60, like every once in a while, people are like, dude, what are you doing? Why is it? Why is it important to stick around 60 cards?
Well, imagine this, and I'm going to go back to poker. I don't know how many people know poker, but it's something that I know very, very well. If you have a 52 card deck, right, and there's 4 aces and there's 4 kings, there's 4 queens, you're looking for those high value cards, right? You're looking for the aces and the kings and the queens. You don't want to have a whole bunch of 2s in your 52 card deck, because then your chances of getting, too high or whatever is going to be that much higher. So when you're playing Magic, it's a similar concept of, you don't want to be adding in cards that are just kind of fluff. They're just there because you want them to be there. You want the cards there to do what you want them to do and to get you to the next step in line. You don't need 30,000 copies of build up and then 1 payoff, and vice versa. You don't need 30,000 copies of payoff and 1 build up.
So I dig it, but I think from the outside perspective, the argument can be made, well, what if all of the cards are like relatively good value, right? And for me, it comes full circle to consistency, right? Because it's not only those really good 4-drops like Questing Beast that are going to win you the game. Like these cards need supporting characters, and it could be as easy as a Paradise Druid that now allows you to play your Questing Beast turn 3, right? But then it all things in balance. These cards need to be balanced. They need to be consistent, because you don't want to be playing widely or like vastly different games. You don't want to play one game that shouts out in this direction and then another game goes way in this direction that won't even seem like they're from the same deck, right? You want to have that game plan and you want to be hitting it again and again and again consistently.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that. I think that there, with 60 cards, again, it was really cool because the new companion Yorion kind of changed the perspective a little bit, where everyone thought it was going to be terrible because it was going up to 80 cards, and we immediately saw that it became one of the best cards ever, just because it was an extra free card in your hand, and that was worth losing a little bit of the consistency. And so I think it is important to state too that going up to 80 cards didn't change the consistency that much. It did mean that they didn't have a turn 3 Teferi every single time, though, or not as often. It did mean that they didn't have, this, but they could also fit more copies in. And so I recognize that there's definitely there's always an argument for being able to go up to more copies. In fact, I think people don't do it often enough, because there's sometimes there are synergies worthwhile enough to maybe go up a little bit in copies. But as you see, most of the competitive decks stick with 60 cards. And if you notice too, they broke it down to where almost every card in that is a 4 of. There's not as many 1 or 2 ofs, whatever. That means the deck was really well thought out. They know exactly their game plan, where it's 4 of these, 4 of these, 4 of these, 4 of these. And especially for brewing, especially these more janky fun decks, if I'm wanting to hit a Brash Taunter, I really need to make sure I can get to those 4 copies more consistently. And this is, again, why we were talking about even doing second win conditions, because even in a 60 card deck, I have played 11 games with 4 copies of something in my deck and never fought it once. And people are always like, Jeff, why didn't you never even played that card? That was a terrible video, all this kind of stuff. I hate those comments, by the way. It's like, I spent 3 hours trying to find the one card, and it sometimes just never happens. And that's why you have to build a deck around just win conditions and like being able to win games, do fun stuff. And those things will happen occasionally, but there is the chance you would just never draw into the 4 copies of something, even in a 6-card deck. You don't want to change the numbers on that any more so when you're trying to find combo, when you're trying to find certain cards to play with.
I pose a question for you guys. We did see Yorion do really, really well. Not only the control decks, but in the ramp decks as well. Is running 80 cards viable without this free creature of Yorion? And then is it viable without the long con, without the Shatter the Skies, without the ECDs, without all of the field wipes, without all of that draw behind it, right? Without the growth spirals and the Uros? Because you're not just adding 20 new permanents to your deck. You're like, well, you are, but some of them are land as well, right? Because you have to make sure that you keep that ratio balanced. Percentage chance of you flooding can now go up, right? So that becomes more of a reality of you having 3 or 4 land cards stuck together. So I think Now, and I don't know, I would love for someone big brain to break this down. Maybe some of the viewers can do this for us. How much does it really lower the consistency? If everything is balanced correctly, right? Lands to creatures to removal within any deck, how much does 80 cards really change percentage win rates against the same decks? I'd love to know.
Well, there's two points with this. One, you got to remember like Yorion is a special card because whenever it enters the battlefield, it's essentially allowing you to replay a lot of these cards that you already have on the battlefield. So yes, you have an 80 card deck, but if you have something like Omen of the Sea and ECD and all this that have entered the battlefield and have value right then, as soon as you play something like Yorion, whether you have an 80 card deck or not, it's not about how many cards are in your deck, it's about how many cards are on the field. And so that's, I think, part of what skews his win percentage to be higher is because he's essentially replaying all of those cards, right? Secondly, if you're going
value town engine,
if you're going to be playing a higher card number deck, you need to have scries, you need to have surveils, you need to have some way to avoid the flooding, because the more lands you play, the higher the chance are that you're just going to hit lands. And a lot of people like to say, oh, it's the shuffler that's broken. But no, like, they actually think about the probability of drawing 5 lands in a row, you know? It's the same way whenever you go to flip a coin. You're not going to hit heads 3 times in a row every time, but you will do it often enough to make you mad, right?
Yeah. The other thing too is I think that like so Commander has a 100 card deck, and you have a different. You don't even have 4 of the same copy of stuff. It's more about having a consistency of cards that do a certain thing. You know, yeah, it's a little bit harder. Commander tends to build a little bit more towards like combos and stuff like that as well. But even that, there's a lot of Commander decks that play really consistently with 100 card decks, not having the same name on any card. You know, and so there's some pretty interesting things that you can still do. So like, I do agree that 60 cards is 9 times out of 10 the best, but I wouldn't say 99 times out of 100. You know, like I really think it's only like 90% of the time is the best. I'm actually surprised how often we don't get to see the more cards played, because if you can fit in 3 copies of something else, and this is maybe just the way that I like to play it, I love knowing that there's something in my deck that's the perfect top deck here. That's the way that I like to play, where other people want to have the same game plan every single time and then go to game 3, go to game 2 if it didn't work out this time. Where for me, I love kind of the best of one type of feel where it's like, I could draw this best thing. And it's happened enough times. We've all had an experience that it was awesome. It was cool, you know, and that's the difference between a Group's Harbinger and, you know, Questing Beast or Gruul Spellbreaker. I've had that question as well. Like, why is Group's Harbinger not played in my decks as much as Gruul Spellbreaker? And it's usually because I'm trying to stick with 60 cards. Gruul Spellbreaker is a little bit better in certain situations. You know, we have all these cards where it's like they're the same 3-drop. They do almost the exact same thing. They fit the slot almost the same way. Why do we play one over the other? And I feel like those are the kinds of things that the nuances that we can get into for forever with this, as far as what we found building. And I know for a lot of you guys, especially if you're free to play players, you build what you have. If you only have 2 Group's Harbingers, you can totally throw in Spellbreakers. You can totally throw in whatever other good 3-drops fits the role. The main thing is just trying to keep the curve right, where you're having, you know, 1, 2, 3. You want to typically have, even in controller decks or all these different types of decks, you're wanting to have a good amount of 2-drops, especially. Your 1, 2, and 3-drop slot have to be really good and consistent. You need to be able to have them in your opening hand consistently as well. So there needs to be enough of them that you're going to be consistently having 1s, 2s, and 3s in your opening hand. And so that's where I feel like going up to like Yorion, going up to 80 cards, everything like that, is that you can still build it where the odds are you're going to be able to play all those ones as well. But you just need to make sure that you're keeping the correct amount of costs, the curve, and the value of that curve consistent.
Yeah, and we were talking about it earlier, you know, people playing 4 copies of decks in these like super top tier decks. One thing you need to think about when looking at cards is what happens if I draw 4 copies of this card? Because again, that's a probability as well, and the vice versa of that. What happens if I never see this card in the entire game? Is your deck still going to be fine if you never see this card? Or is this deck going to be fine if you draw 4 copies of Garrick's Harbinger or Garrick's, you know, whatever? That's why you see some cards only have 2 copies, because you don't ever want to have 4 copies of a Garrick in your hand because planeswalkers don't stack, right?
Yep.
This comes into play with Questing Beast a little bit too, and we've seen the argument made, well, it's a legendary creature or a planeswalker that it doesn't stack, you can't have multiples. But those legendary creatures are prone to removal ASAP. People are coming after them because of the value they bring into the game. Not always a bad idea to have a secondary nuke in case the first one mistriggers.
Right. And there's
Talk
always...
about that. Why? When do you go to 4 copies? When do you go to 3, 2, or 1? What's your guys' kind of rules on those cards?
Well, like HGG said, and this is kind of a learned ability or a learned knowledge, is the removal rate of cards, right? If I play down a Questing Beast, like you said, you can probably rest assured in 1 or 2 turns your opponent's got to find a way to remove it, because if they don't, you're going to win. To where something like Paradise Druid, your opponent may not even fiddle with it. Like, whatever, it has hexproof. It's worth more trouble to get rid of it than it's worth to just leave there. So
they might try to get rid of it on turn 2 or turn 3.
Like it's just difficult.
But after that, it becomes less relevant to the game once more mana comes out. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, the rate of removal is a big thing. So legendaries, how many copies do you guys typically put in? I agree with you. Some cards like Questing Beast, Torbrand, and we see a bunch of versions where there's some decks that run like 2 copies of Torbrand in mono red. There's some that run 4 copies. Why do you think there is that difference?
How consistently do you want to drop it? Especially with the 4 drops, Questing Beast and Torbrand especially really fit this profile nicely. They have such a high value impact when they hit the field that you only have 3 and take the chance of not drawing it until turn 7 isn't worth it. I would much rather have the slight chance of drawing multiples in my hand and not drawing him at all, right? And especially, again, in this case with Torbrand and Questing Beast especially, they are such powerful creatures that they're very prone to removal, so they're not going to be on the field long. But we can come to the opposite side of that spectrum, and we look at, I don't even know, maybe like a legendary enchantment or something, right? Something that's probably not going to see removal as consistently, right? Not as many decks are running enchantment removal as opposed to creature or planeswalker removal. It is there a little bit, but it's not going to be as prevalent. So if I had, and even certain planeswalkers come into this, and mana cost. So if it's a 7 cost legendary, I might probably only run 2. 1 if I can search for it or have crazy draw engines. If it's a lower cost legendary, probably 4 because you just want to drop it early game really consistently, right? So I guess those are my general go-tos, and it does depend on each deck and how the deck strategies and synergies work, but as a general umbrella rule, I think that's it.
Yeah, Questing Beast comes in really well with this one because there are some decks that run 3 copies of it that we've seen in metagame, or there's a lot that have run 4 copies. Same type of thing with Torbrand. And for me, the value of the card itself, I want to draw it so consistently that it is worth drawing extra copies. The reason why it ever drops down to 3 or 2 or something like that isn't so much because it's a legendary, it's because it's 4 cost. It's because as you go up the curve, you want less of those cards in there. So like even if you're playing a deck that's Sublime Epiphany, the 6 mana, new amazing does everything type of card is so good for it. Unless you're built to be able to get to that quick or consistently in the early game, you may not want 4 copies of it. 2 is going to be enough because you get to, if you do find it early game, you have a lot more game to try to find that card basically. And so that's the other way I go about it is like, I feel like I have a lot more 4 drops in the early game. And then I kind of go closer to 3, 2, or 1 drops when it comes to like my anything costing 4 or greater for mana costs. What about you guys? Is that like what are the kind of like rules or other things that you guys do with your mana cost stuff?
Yeah, like when you're building a deck, you need to think about it this way: like the number of games you're going to get down 1 land is 100%. If you're not getting down 1 land, you should probably be mulliganing your hand, right? And so you can rest assured when you're looking at your 1-drops that 4 copies of a 1-drop, you can play all 4 of those in a game. And that's kind of what y'all are talking about here with the Sublime Epiphany and going up in mana cost. Is think of it circles inside of circles inside of circles. And the further out you get on your circles, the harder it's going to be to cost, or the harder it's going to be to cast it because of the cost, and the less you're going to want it. So the further you get from that middle, the less likely you have it, and the less you want it in your deck, right? And then going back to 4 copies with legendaries and all that, if it's your centerpiece, if it's your main thread, it's your like oomph to the deck, running 4 copies, whether it's going to get removed or whatever, yeah, it's not bad because you're looking for it, you're hoping, you're searching, you're loving it. It's whereas something like Sublime Epiphany may just be flavor. So the way I weigh it is like, is this card flavor for the deck? Is it my complement in the deck, or is it my main piece? Is it the bread and butter of the deck, right?
Is there ever a time you only run 1 copy? Personally, for me, no.
I will if it's something like a fling, but that's because I'm like janky at heart, and so the idea to me, and y'all remember I've never hit Mythic, so I'm not exactly completely competitive or any of that. The idea to me of sometimes hitting that one off, and like Jeff was talking about, the thought of, hey, I could top deck this and it would be perfect. That's those one-offs that I do. Those ones that I'm like, in this one scenario when I have this one situation, yeah, let me draw this and have fun. Because again, my main thing isn't competitive. It is fun and Magic. So
Yeah, for me with one-ups or something like that, it's sometimes because I'm having a hard time splitting between, is it better to have an eliminate, heartless act, or aggressive darkness in this slot? And sometimes I'll just split the difference. Okay, I'm going to have one of each, so I'm hoping that I draw the right one at the right time. Because there's some decks that one won't work completely and the other one will. And so for me, it's kind of like instead of trying to choose 2 wrongs or 2 rights, I just I split the difference and then hope that the universe helps me out along the way, that thing. I don't know. So that's where one-ups come for me. And then also in sideboarding, if you're playing best of 3, the gameplay changes completely. Where best of 1, you may be fine with having a one-up because you need to be able to have an answer for the more aggro deck. You need to have an answer. You need to have one negate in the deck because it might just come into play, and that one negate can save you the game against a control deck. Where they all they have to do is hit 1 Bolas' Citadel or something like that. So there are instances where I think one-ups is okay, especially best of 1, best of 3. You're going to see a lot more one-ups in the sideboard, and then have it be a more consistent game plan and deck in the main board, usually in best of 3, or something that they know that I'm taking this out as soon as I play up against this deck and bringing these in. And so like there are really competitive decks. In fact, there's been a lot of really competitive decks along the way that play one-ups. Combo decks can do that as well, where it's like, okay, I know I just need to get to this one card, and I have 15 ways to find it that are cheaper. That's fine as well. And so yeah, I do think there are times for one-ups, but you have to be like, you have to have reasons to bring it down to 1, or instead of it being a 2 or 3 or 4 drop. Otherwise, you probably ought to just find another slot for that card.
right, and also there's cards like, and I'm not saying this is super efficient in order to go out and craft it or any of that, but there are cards like Grim Tutor, to where if you're playing a combo deck, having a copy, just a one-off copy of Grim Tutor, is kind of like having a 5th copy of that combo card that you're looking for, right? Because it allows you to go in there and just find it. So sometimes it's fine to run a one-off as a pseudo version or a pseudo like grab of this combo piece. And I feel like in combo decks, like you said, you'll see that a little bit more often, where it's just like, it's fine to just have this as a one-off because it's going to help you find that expansion explosion or the peer into the abyss or whatever, right, 1 card combo you're trying to do.
Speaking of Grim Tutor, I'm almost inclined to take the exact opposite direction, where I run 4 Grim Tutors and maybe some one-ofs, because now I know I don't need to draw those other cards. I could just get them at will whenever I want. Another note for me personally when building of one-ofs, I think maybe there is ways to make it work, like Jeff said, in combos and stuff. But how many cards of your deck are you able to consistently play in matches? How many cards do you have remaining when that match ends? Is it over 30? Because in my case, if it's over 30, even if it's an incredibly expensive legendary enchantment that's not going to see removal, like Bolas' Citadel, like Chromatic Orrery, unless I'm consistently playing through almost my whole deck, or like Doctor said, I have a tutor to search for it, I think I still want 2 copies just to split the difference, because mathematics, there should be 1 in my first 30 and 1 in my second 30. So at least in my general matches, I will play on average 1 copy of this card.
I think that's a great point. I don't know about y'all. We've been going for a little bit over an hour. I think we've encompassed, everything from janky brews to competitive brews to how to start, where to end. I think we've done a pretty good job of, yes, being general with our tips and our, this and that. But I also feel like we've given enough examples to where if people want to come in and look at this and say, okay, I get what you're saying, because I've tried to play Brash Taunter and I had those problems, right? I tried to play, what was that big serpent you were talking about, or the big fish you were talking about, Jeff?
Oh, Fleet Swallow.
Yeah, right. Like I feel like we've touched enough on janky and on competitive and tied it up in a nice little bow. So is there anything y'all really want to add to this at the end? Any special tips that we may have left out on how we brew or how you brew, or anything in general that you think the fans should just absolutely need to know and we didn't get to touch on?
Yeah, I've got something. Watch YouTubers. And I'm not just saying me, but like honestly, like, so that's what we do. But I bet you anything, the reason that we're doing it is because we watched a bunch of YouTubers. And that's what got us into brewing and doing all this kind of stuff. Like for me, it was MTG Goldfish and Convert Go Blue. Like we kind of were like the ones that got me into like, you know what, I could do this. This is fun. I want to add my stuff to it, because I could see they couldn't add quite enough. But yeah, and so that's what I would say is watching other people that do brews, watching other people that have the content for this stuff is something that definitely adds to creating brews. And sometimes it's not rebuilding the deck that they built, but it's building the deck. Like most of the decks that I built that were like my favorite decks was the deck that destroyed MTG Goldfish when I was watching him. It was the deck they played against. I was able to recreate ideas like that. And those are some of my favorite brews.
My pro tip: if you're playing best of 1, after you've done your whole deck, trim 1 land and add your favorite card. The best of 1 has that algorithm that will compare 2 draw hands against each other in best of 3. So it will give you the hand with the most land for your permanents. So you can kind of be sneaky and get away with trimming 1, and then that will allow you a more efficient draw hand, which is really nice.
Alrighty. Well, I actually don't have anything to add. I think I've exhausted my knowledge on brewing and all that for the day. But I think y'all did a great job here wrapping it up, and great pro tips in the end. As always, everybody, if you're looking to find the podcast in an audio form, check SoundCloud, Spotify. I still gotta get on it on Apple Podcasts. Don't harass me. It's on Google Play though. You can find it here on YouTube. All that great stuff. And truly, I can say this, at least personally. I don't want to speak on y'all's behalf, but I'm sure it's the same. We're very, very grateful to people that come in and watch this podcast, as this is a form of Magic content that we don't get to make that often. Every day we're out playing new decks and explaining the decks and all that, which is great and it's fun, and that's the main reason we got into it. Being able to create Magic content that's not just, well, let me go play this deck and let me go play this deck, but being able to actually step back and look in on the game and talk about it has been a true blessing, and the amount of support and appreciation that this series has gotten has been so amazing.
Yeah, I'm incredibly grateful for you two and everybody who's taken the time to tune in the previous weeks here while we're getting things up and running. Listen, and I hope they've enjoyed and found some value from it. I do want to quickly add, before I personally sign off for the day, that if you liked this video and you're interested in seeing any more discussions like this with how do you build decks and like kind of going in a little bit deeper into it, make sure to reach out on the Discords, on the YouTube, wherever you guys are talking to either one of us. Let us know what you guys are interested in seeing as far as this podcast goes. And then a reminder that next Friday, we're going to be building a 100% original deck from 3 of the greatest content creators Magic the Gathering Arena has ever seen. So I hope you're interested. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, all that great stuff.
Yeah, share this with other people too. Podcast doesn't show up as much in YouTube. As far as like all the algorithm stuff, like podcasts, they don't grow as organically sometimes as YouTube channels and stuff. So if you guys like this content, share it with your friends. Let them know that this is happening. Kind of get it off the ground, because that'll help as well. And I know we're trying to do our best as well to kind of show it. But like Dr. Wilkins said, this is the kind of content that we love to be able to do. We can't always do on our channels necessarily because it doesn't grow the same way. But yeah, thank you again to Doctor for being able to for actually taking a lot of the work behind the scenes with this. Awesome guy. You should subscribe. If you're watching, you probably already have, but do it anyway.
All right. Thanks, everybody.
All right.
See y'all
Thanks again,
next
guys.
time.
I really appreciate it.